Let's welcome Texas Congressman Dr. Ronnie Jackson in for some more on this. Thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, what the state is going through, we appreciate your time.
Thank you, Heather. I appreciate you having me.
So what is the latest on the ground in Texas? How are your constituents doing?
Well, we're doing fairly well here in my district. Some of the other districts are hurting a lot worse than we are, but everybody's got issues right now. And, the power's back on, which is great. People, were suffering because they were cold for days on end. But now we have a new issue. Now that the water lines are thawing out, we're finding that lots of the water lines have bursted. And water pressure's dropped, and people don't have potable water. Like you said, there's about 14 million people in the state of Texas right now that don't have drinkable water. And there's been a rush on the grocery stores for food and water and things of that nature. So people are having trouble finding food as well. So we need to get water out to people. We got to get the food banks opened up and get food distribution going. And so we still have a challenge ahead of us. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stories are just heartbreaking that are coming out of Texas in terms of some of the deaths. An 11-year-old boy who was attempting to sleep and stay safe in his home with his family, and he died of hypothermia inside his home. And then the gentleman who died in his recliner next to his wife of hypothermia. It's just heartbreaking. A lot of finger pointing going on as a result. Are you any closer to finding out what the real story is in terms of how this happened, why it happened?
Well, it's coming out slowly but surely. We will get an answer to this. It's going to be looked at by, I think, the state legislature is going to do an investigation now. I'm sure there'll be an investigation from the federal standpoint as well to some extent. But it basically boils down to poor leadership from ERCOT, which is the entity that oversees the Texas power grid, and from too much of a reliance on renewable yet unreliable sources of energy here in the state of Texas, which you wouldn't expect from an oil and gas state like Texas. But we have learned to rely extensively on wind and solar, and our wind power froze overnight. And we went from what I've seen 49 or 41% estimate, 25 at the lowest I've seen, to zero essentially in 24 hours as far as the electricity produced by wind. And the rest of the power, the rest of the sources we had out there, oil and gas and coal and nuclear, weren't able to keep up with what was going on when wind fell off so precipitously. So we have got to do a better job on making sure that we are prepared for something like this in the future. And we cannot rely as heavily in the state of Texas on renewable yet seriously unreliable sources of energy.
Yeah, I'm glad that you explained that, because there's been some confusion because people look at the wind farms there in Texas and wind energy and solar, and wind specifically, I think, was only about 20% of the state supplied by wind energy. So I was wondering, how did that impact this large number of people? How did that impact the grid so much?
Well, the thing is, when the wind went away, it's 20% was pretty sizable. When that 20% went from 20% to 0%, then all the other forms of energy, specifically natural gas, had to ramp up. I think they ramped natural gas up 800% initially to try to compensate for that. But part of the problem is ERCOT had not winterized any of the grid. They hadn't taken the steps necessary to have everything winterized. And some of those natural gas pipelines ended up freezing. The pressure dropped because they were using so much of it, they couldn't keep the pressure up. And then the lines froze, and then it just it actually snowballed, to use a term, that was appropriate for the time.
Right.
But I think that we have got to do a better job. Our leadership failed us in this regard.
Why? Why were they not prepared? I mean, they also knew there were some warning signs that this crisis was coming, this specific weather crisis.
Oh, it's absolutely. We're starting to find out now that NOAA, the National Weather Service, and even the staff meteorologist that works for ERCOT are sending out warning signals as far as 10 days out, saying this is about to be an unmitigated disaster in the state of Texas. We're going to see record lows like we haven't seen in decades. And, for whatever reason, they didn't really act upon it. And I don't know if 10 days would have even been enough time to go out and winterize stuff. But, there was no attempt to prepare the public for what was about to happen. So we need to look into this. A lot of these members don't even live in the state of Texas. We have a lot of good talent here in Texas. We don't need to rely on people that live, outside of our state or outside of our country to manage our power grid. So I hope we can fix all of these issues, but we have challenges ahead of us. But we're going to learn from our mistakes. We're resilient here in the state of Texas. We're going to fix what's broken, and we're going to make it right.
Yeah, I love the state of Texas. And you actually went into what I was going to ask you about. Some of those board members not even living in the state. So perhaps that's some of the fallout that will be corrected, because it really didn't make a whole lot of sense. How does the state of Texas keep this from happening again?
Well, we've got to go in and, we've been in a situation. Texas has a lot of wide open areas. We have a lot of wind, especially up in the area I live up here. So we're an area that's perfect for wind turbines and things of that nature. The federal government has pushed out so many subsidies for these types of, renewable, but like I said, unreliable, it turns out, sources of energy that, they've dominated what's going on up here now in Texas, or down here in Texas and up in my district. And we have to get away from that. We have to go back to what's reliable. We have to start reinforcing our infrastructure for the fossil fuels that we've relied on for a long time that are reliable. We can turn those up when we need to. So we need to there's been some bad incentives in the form of subsidies that have really, we need to stop the wind production right now in the state of Texas. We have enough wind production right now. We need to focus on the fossil fuels right now, and we need a good, healthy balance that won't let this happen again.
Yeah. What about not selling the wind farms to China? I mean, that is a little surprising that people have discovered. The large wind farm that was just recently sold, I think, out near a military base.
Yep, that's right. And, we can't allow that to happen because we don't want the Chinese government in control of our power grid in that regard either. And we also find out that a lot of these solar panels and things that are coming over here that are populating, our state and all over the country, they're manufactured in China as well. So we need to look at the big picture here. We're getting too focused on the subsidies that have been pushed out as part of, this new Green Deal and this green energy plan. And we've left ourselves unprepared for a disaster like this.
Yeah, China, the largest manufacturer of transformers in the world as well. So President Biden is expected to go to Texas this week. He finally approved a disaster declaration for Texas just yesterday. What does the state now need from him and the federal government?
Well, what we need is the FEMA. We need the federal dollars that come in that go along with the natural disaster. We've been declared as a natural disaster now, so that's a good step. So we need that federal money to come in and help us recover from this disaster, just like we would any other disaster. If it was a hurricane, or if it were wildfires, or if it were tornadoes or whatever, we need that money, that federal money, to come in and help us recover. What we don't need is, we do not need this to be a call for the federal government to come in and to start regulating our power grid in Texas. We do not want our power grid regulated by the federal government. That will lead to all kinds of other problems. So this cannot be seen as a mandate for that to happen, and I will push back on that aggressively.
Well, now that's another question, and I actually didn't get into that with you, but since you brought it up, some folks saying that that's the reason that this happened, because Texas was not regulated, the power grid.
Well, that's, the state needs to fix that, though. We have our own power grid. We can regulate that internally. The governor, the state legislature is going to make sure that our power grid is regulated appropriately from within. We do not need the federal government's help. Believe me, every time the federal government touches something, it ultimately breaks, and I don't want any part of it.
I think a lot of our viewers will agree with you there. And we know that, what is it? Everything's bigger and better in Texas. Something like that.
That's right.
All right.
That's right.
Dr. Ronnie Jackson, Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Heather.
All right. We're thinking about all the folks down there in Texas.